I've entitled this presentation Freedom to Communicate, Adventures in Interpersonal Communication, because freedom to communicate is not really communicating how we want to or listening how we want to. Rather, it is communicating in the best way possible. Next slide. My name is Candy Crosby Hastings, and this presentation is in fulfillment of an interpersonal communications class I am taking through Liberty University, HSCO 508. Next slide. The following presentation will explain my goals of communication for my personality type, or perhaps in spite of my personality type. It will focus on the idea of enlarging the conversation. For someone with my personality type, enlarging the conversation really focuses on the ability to listen, to show empathy, and to not try to prove my competence or my point in communication. It's an enjoyable communication experience for both people involved. Next slide. A little bit about my background. I am the married and homeschooling mom of 2 sons. I recently completed my double major for my bachelor's through Liberty University, my primary major religion, secondary education. I'm now working on completing my master's degree in human services with the Christian Ministries Cognate. Next slide. The overarching goal of this presentation is to present areas of strengths and weaknesses in my communication. I hope to improve my own communication skills for the ministry to which I feel called. Next slide. According to a Uniquely You personality assessment, my behavioral blend reflects that I am both dominant and competent, and that I do show more tendencies for task orientation rather than people orientation. According to Graph 1, which reflects what I believe people expect of me, I believe people expect me to be both dominant and competent. Graph 2 reflects what I'm really like. I am dominant, submissive, and competent. The high S on one chart and the low S on another chart reflects the fact that I am more submissive in personal relationships rather than to the general public. According to an interpersonal communications test that was also required for this class, I am an insightful person. What that means is I am able to read people's feelings and emotions as I communicate with them. Next slide. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. This is a Bible verse from Romans 12:18. This is something that I need to remind myself of fairly frequently because of my dominant personality. A little more about my background is I do come from a long line of dominant personalities. However, that dominant personality trait has not necessarily been expressed in the most fruitful manner possible. I've written some statements on this slide, statements such as, "This dress is ugly," "Why would you like that kind of music? It's terrible," or "I cannot believe that you would think that way." Those are statements that have often been used in favor of more productive statements such as, "That dress is not my preference, but I'm glad that you like it," or "That's an interesting choice in music. Here's the type that I like," or "Help me understand your perspective." I've also included a quote. When people form attributions, they devise theories or explanations about other people's behavior that provide a way of making sense out of whatever is occurring. Often this means assigning a cause or intention to the behavior. Attribution, of course, is not always necessarily a negative thing unless we do use our dominant personalities, our competent personalities, to try to downplay what someone else feels. Next slide. The same author believes that our identities are formed through our communication. I believe this is especially true in early childhood. What we say to children will often form how they feel about themselves, whether they see themselves as invaluable or valuable. When my sons were around 2 and 4 years old, I really experienced a paradigm shift in my communication patterns. I experienced an emotional breakdown of sorts. I realized that if I were to use the same communication processes that I used when I was growing up, my sons were going to grow up feeling incompetent and invalued. And perhaps they would even hate some of the things that were said to them. At times, I still struggle with the idea that a parent should be dominant over children. However, I believe this early parenting experience led to my submissive side in my personality profile. As the authors on this slide point out, everyone relates to some social community, ethnic group, nation, race, to which he belongs through communication. And only through interaction with other subjects of communication, the person builds his identity and forms his self-determination. That is a very interesting perspective to think about, that our early communication does form our identities. Next slide. Stewart believes that families and peer groups affect the intensity of most people's stereotypes. This is a powerful statement that I learned again when my sons were younger. I was a part of an online homeschooling group. As I mentioned, I do homeschool our 2 sons. And I had made a point that I personally thought was rather clever. And another mom on the group pointed out to me, she had really called me on that and said, you know, you should really paraphrase that with saying that that is your opinion. Not that it's not a valid opinion, but someone else's opinion who disagrees could be just as valid. That statement really made me think. Because of my dominant, confident personality in public settings, I have a tendency to use what Stewart calls debate over dialogue. And that is still a real temptation for me in my communication. However, what this mom taught me was the value over interpersonal communication over impersonal communication. Next slide. That leads us to the question, are we able to change the identities that do form in our early childhood? I personally believe that we can. As these authors point out, the real identity of a subject can be defined only as a result of his participation in the cultural and communicative processes. Communication helps us to identify our real identity. The more meaningful and rich is the interaction between the actors, the more correct and complicated is the process of their identification. What I really need to ask myself, as I did in my early parenting experiences, is how do I want to portray myself to other people? This is self-verification and self-preservation. However, it goes beyond wanting others to see me in a favorable light. It goes into actually taking on the image that I want to convey. One of my personal biggest pitfalls is defensiveness. As Peterson points out here, defensiveness is really equated to an attack when we're communicating with others. So that is something that I really need to work on in my own personal communication. Next slide. Now, communication is very influenced by our perception. A good illustration of our perception is in the metaphor of inhaling and exhaling. Inhaling involves selecting, organizing, inferring. Exhaling is really all about self-disclosure and openness. Next slide. Here's a little example of inhaling. Now, our selecting is our choice about what we want to perceive. Do we really want to pay attention to what others are saying? And if we choose to be overly selective about what we want to hear, we can be easily deceived about what's being communicated to us. It's kind of like this picture of the koala. He looks cute and cuddly, but he's really not. The organizing is making sense of the situation and making sense of the communication, just as these penguins in this picture are organizing themselves into a pattern. Inferring now is different. It goes beyond the hard facts. It goes into what I call the gray area of communication, sensing what other people are feeling, sensing of what other people are trying to say. Next slide. Now, exhaling is really about being open and honest. As Stewart points out here, in order for the relationship to build and develop, both individuals have to disclose and be open to other people's self-disclosure. Openness depends on three factors: self-awareness, self-acceptance, and trust. Next slide. Now, just for another quick quote from Stewart, self-disclosure is revealing to another person how you perceive and are reacting to the present situation. And that is by going into our past and how that affects our understanding of current situations. Now, how that goes on with the dominant personality is that we need to really understand what other people are self-disclosing to us as well, so that as this jellyfish, that we're not going to sting others. Next slide. Now, something that I found very interesting is self-disclosure is really a right-brained phenomenon. As a dominant personality, a competent personality, I am the type of person that likes to analyze and reason, so I often use the left hemisphere of my brain in my thinking and my communicating. But this is also helpful because now when I communicate, I'm able to think that I need to purposely use this right brain thinking to react to people emotion to emotion. The authors here provide a quote. Therapist self-disclosure refers to a technique that uses language to communicate the therapist's right hemisphere experience of himself and or the patient. This is helpful to me with the ministry that I do feel called to in human services and counseling. Next slide. I want to share a little personal story about my adventures in self-disclosure, I should say. When I was a teenager, I took music lessons, which included voice lessons. In my voice lessons, I learned about the head voice and the chest voice, the tones of singing. Well, I awoke one morning and I had this idea in my mind: use your chest voice. And to me, that meant that I was to self-disclose and use my experiences and vulnerabilities to help others. Next slide. This leads us to Peterson's levels of communication. Level 1 communication, the head voice, what I consider it, is communication that is just conveying of facts and information. It's very unsatisfying for those involved in the communication. Whereas level 2 communication involves personal sharing. It involves that self-disclosure, and it's much more satisfying to both people involved. Next slide. Now, noise pollution are those deterrents from communication that can be something as simple as a noise outside that detracts from our communication. The internal noise pollution that affects me the most is, again, that ability to prove myself, that want to show that I am competent. As far as external noise pollution, the biggest thing for me is stress. When I get stressed, I get grouchy, I get emotional, I get irritable. Now, I can correct this lack of communication for myself, though, by understanding my internal thought processes. I can analyze what is making me feel this way, what is making me feel that I need to prove myself, and tell myself that that just isn't true. At the same time, I can correct the external noise pollution by evaluating myself realistically and reassigning realistic goals. Next slide. My personal communication goal plan of action is to see the perspective of others, focus on what others are feeling, focus on relationships, not points or tasks or my own competence. Self-disclose and listen for others' self-disclosure as well, and to stop becoming defensive. My insightfulness is going to be helpful in these areas because I can relate to other people's emotions. This last slide is a list of my references that I did use for this presentation. I'm very grateful to these authors because they really have taught me how to have freedom in communication.